Welcome to the second panel of our symposium. The panel is entitled Dialogue, Presence and the Gift. The title came very much from discussions between the three speakers and myself a couple of weeks ago, because they don't relate just to one person's talk, but they seem to encompass some of the issues that were going to be discussed. One of the things that we started to think about was the way in which it becomes impossible to work out that if a dialogue, one of our headings, if a dialogue is only carried out between those who agree, can there ever be any kind of true change? We touched on some of those points this morning. I love the idea of hope that Siân brought up, but how do we make that dialogue between, and we got that from some of the questions, like who is the dialogue with? Who is it who's speaking? And if the dialogues are only carried out between those that agree, can there ever be change? And is it the role of the artist and the curator to impart knowledge to people who are already available to receive that knowledge? Or should it be a more challenging process of engagement with those outside of existing shared sets of social belief? And what we wanted to do in this session, last session of the morning, and through a series of really fascinating case studies, we want to explore some of the ways in which very particular historical contexts and institutions have been used to test the boundaries of what is shared understanding and what methods can be used to create constructive dialogue. Our speakers in this panel are Professor Samson Kambalu from the University of Oxford, and more recently known to you probably as the artist responsible for Antelope and the Problematic of the Gift in terms of the fourth plinth in Trafalgar Square. Pratāp Rughani, who's a professor here at UAL, who's going to talk to us about who is it you can speak to. But he's going to show it, and it's very much to do with this being a forum where we can talk about ideas in process. He's going to talk about work that isn't yet finished. He's going to talk about work that tries to embrace the impossibilities of certain forms of dialogue in relation to historical moments and the present. And then we're finishing, by no means finishing, we're moving on to Professor Mark Seeley, who's a professor here at UAL, but probably better known to many of you as the director of Autograph, the very renowned gallery and cultural centre in Rivington Place. We'll have lots of time, I'm sure, to talk as a panel and to answer questions from the audience. But I just want, by the way, Samson is up there on the Zoom call because he's at Art Basel, and Switzerland seems totally overcome by fog at the moment. Poor Nicholas, who was on this morning, only got here by the skin of his teeth at 3 in the morning, but Samson missed it. So, Samson, can I hand over to you?
Yes, so I will start here with I think it's good that I'm going to talk about cinema and praxis and how it relates to the problematic of the gift. The gift is where I'm coming from. Of course, the core. I'm coming from Malawi, and there, here it's otherwise known as underdevelopment. But I think it's simplistic. I did my PhD on the problematic of the gift and how the problem of the gift animates society. And I studied my own traditions in Malawi, the Nyao-Masking tradition, and it's a very sophisticated philosophy, that by coming out of it, I decided that perhaps Southern Africa is the hardest place for capitalism to break because of this sophisticated philosophy these people developed. Okay. So the gift is basically well, I think it will come up as I speak. You get to know. But African society in Southern Africa are driven with the gift. That's the type opposed to here, capital. There, it's the gift at the heart of African thinking. It's actually pretty polar opposites, and that's what's happening at Trafalgar Square. I think for me, Nelson represents the capital, a patriarchal, I could call it roughly, economy, and Chirembo there presents the horizontal gift economy. So it's a good confrontation on Trafalgar Square. Chirembo captures the skyline like an angel, while Nelson is trying to reach the heavens. It's a good confrontation. It's exactly what's happening in South Africa for me, Southern Africa for me. So I was glad to be invited and to make this work for Trafalgar Square, so then I could share my thinking that's inspired by the economies of where I'm coming from. It was very important for me. It was a big revelation because I went to a Western school in Malawi, Kams Academy. It's the notorious Eton of Africa. And I still couldn't understand African art through my Western education, where art was centered around mimesis, art as a representation. And it's only when I moved into economics, let's say, somehow when I was working on my PhD, it occurred to me that maybe I should try looking elsewhere. And I stumbled on the problem of the gifts. And for me, when I looked at philosophies of the gifts, that's when things started falling into place. Finally, I agreed that, okay, this is leading somewhere. Because all my Western education in art couldn't really explain to me what I had experienced growing up there. But when I moved to economics, I said it's a problem with a gift. It came actually out of nowhere. I was reading in a bath one afternoon, and I moved on to that. So anyway, can you play the first slide, please? Can you hear me? If you can play the first slide, just play that. It's one example of a Nyao mask, and these are how you see the masks when I was growing up. I mean, 3 years ago, we were back in Africa filming for the BBC, and these structures are still ruling the villages in Africa. Are you able to play this video? So it's lively affair, these masks. You can stop it now, yeah? It's an example of what masking is like in Africa. It's happening now. It hasn't abated at all. I mean, the British try to tangle with these things, but it's difficult because masking, unlike other traditions in Africa, they're actually science. You know, it's not really metaphysics. It's not something you can put away. In fact, for me, the West has failed to put away its own masks. I can quickly attribute that, let's say, things like racism are part of the West putting away its masks. So to replace them, it replaces masking with other people, refugees, black people, whatever. But maybe if the West brought back its masks, racism will go away. My theory is that as long as the West denies its animatic side, this side of the human, because masking is how the mind constitutes itself. You cannot have a mind without this other. And in Africa, we just acknowledge it. We live with this other. And every now and then it comes out. So that's happened in a rough. So the Africans need this, and it's difficult to see how we can stop it because it's part of human nature. You cannot actually exist without these structures. If you're not acknowledging them in art, you create them by other means. As I say, by othering other people, for instance. Okay, can we play the next this one? Hold on. Actually, I'll be quick, but actually what you saw was a train. So I'll show you another version of a train. This is by the Lumiere brothers. another version of the train from French modernity. The other train was a figure of Malawian modernity. But you can see the music is equally as pain. It's equally esoteric. Okay, you can stop it. For me, I mean, this is for me as the music in this film is esoteric, seen as strange, but the same in Africa, when the music that's used for masking is as strange to me as an African as it is to you. The art is supposed to be otherworldly. It's not like I understand what's going on with the singing. When I was growing up, I was constantly enchanted, and then the artists who make the masks make sure that it's supposed to be that way. It's supposed to be otherworldly. And my work actually exists between that figure of Malawian modernity, which the train, which celebrated the arrival of the train in Southern Africa. And these trains were actually what used to take men to South Africa and Zimbabwe to work in the mines. There was a time in the late 19th century when you couldn't find men in the African village, actually, because they were shipped to the mines in Zimbabwe and South Africa to work in the gold mines there. So the African maskers, they made the train to celebrate this foreboding image. I remember I was working with a train in Berlin and people were unsettled because they say that in Berlin the train reminds of the Holocaust, shipping people to the camps. And the same in Africa, the train has a foreboding image because it also recalls the time when hundreds of young men were packed to work in the mines in South Africa and leaving behind only women in the villages. So my work exists between the traditional structures. They're not traditional because you can't really call masks. Masks are always a present, I really believe the last man on earth will be a mask. But and it exists between cinema. If you can play, my work exists between those traditional masks, like and the Lumiere brothers, early film. So I've situated myself between the two. This is like many artists in Africa, actually. African photography is big because when photography was introduced in Africa, many Africans saw its potential for performance to animate. And so it was very close to the African tradition, not so much painting, representation, but certainly photography. For its tendency for repetition, it was picked up in Africa. We have great photographers in Africa, CD Bays and the like. It's not a coincidence. But photography really captures very well the African sense of time. So anyway, if you play this video 1,000 years, maybe. To put it roughly, you say that my work is a form of masking. And indeed, when I moved to Europe, when I started making these films, they took away my sense of alienation. I walked around with the camera, and I don't plan anything. I wear a hat like this, and this was in London. And I like early film, by the way, Charlie Chaplin and the like, which was very popular also in Malawi. And I don't plan. When I see a scene, I see these ghosts and I perform. I ask strangers to film me. And this was at a building site in London. Okay, next one. The films are very psychogeographical, meaning that they capture what I was feeling at the time. Sometimes histories of the place, etc. So there's a hope. London, Bollard, the man dusting, I got that from Charlie Chaplin. I watch a lot of films so that when I walk, these tropes can revisit me as my own ghosts, if you like. This is Mountain Man. I made in California, in the footsteps of one of my favorite filmmakers, Edward Muybridge. And if you play this, I was in the forest. It was a famous forest in Academy. There were walkers in there, and that's what I did, inspired by a sense of magic in that part of the world. You can see the influence of Naniniya time in my bridge. Okay, so when I speak of let me speak a bit about time in my work. The time you can see in my work is what you can hear in African music. You hear it in popular music, for instance, inspired by African music. Naniniya time doesn't begin or end, you know. I like that you can start anywhere with my films, and maybe you can just take an image and complete the film in your head. But Naniniya time for me is where the crash is. That's in colonialism, because that's in Malawi, the British brought this very linear time of work. And it crashed with the Naniniya sense of time of Africans. And then when I was growing up, the projectionists used to take Hollywood films that are highly structured and then they'll re-edit them, remix them to cater for the average African audience. Because African audiences, their sense of time, they want you to deliver from moment to moment. Hence, for me, I like to speak enthusiasm, which in UK sometimes is seen as suspicious, but in Africa, it's actually when you're structured that people begin to suspect that you have a hidden agenda. So, because it's the whole point is that when you're delivering, it has to be from moment to moment. Pretty much like Shakespeare. Shakespeare didn't wait for the play. He just didn't write words to deliver a message, but every word was its own moment. And that's the kind of thing I want to do in my work. This is non-linear. Every moment has to count. Yeah. Okay. I'll show you next quickly. Non-linear time, by the way, is what is encapsulated in the gift. Non-linear time is that of the gift, and structured time is that of the commodity. Right. To put it roughly. So this is how my films are shown in galleries or immersive. I even sometimes use text. And the text you can see on the walls, the white chap, which is me talking about watching films as a child in Africa. Okay, next. More examples. I make my films all over the place. This is, I think, at a transport museum in Covent Garden. What is it? Yeah, I think so. This is where I made so I share these films were first shared on Facebook. The Trust Me was discovered on Facebook. So I tell my students, no excuses. All the curators are looking on Instagram, on Facebook. If you've got anything to say, post it there. A curator or a gallerist to look will find it. I used to make these films and then post them on Facebook with my sisters and stuff. And Stevenson Gallery from South Africa saw them. And we did a show in South Africa. And then Okwi saw them, the director of Venice Biennale, and then invited me over, and that's what happened. But you can't make my films if you don't know the language of, if you haven't, I trained as a painter, trained as a sculptor, all of it. And Okwi must have been smart, because my dad in South Africa was surprised that he wanted to invite me to Venice, ignoring all the other artists in the gallery. But I think Okwi had an eye, because when he asked, where is this guy? I happened to be,
Samson, I don't mean to interrupt you, but maybe we need to speed up a little bit, just worrying about our session. You're a bit over time.
I'm over time by how many minutes?
Okay.
Okay, can I finish then? I think we're finished. Next slide. I finished. So you can see the sculpture here simply uses the language of film. The main star is big and support star is small, no? End of story. But this, the footprint is for a horse. So what's also means about these sculptures is that actually the bigger man could represent the empire, the horse, you know? Especially, it becomes more obvious when you look at the other plinths on the Trafalgar Square, because it's men sitting on a horse. A big mass and a small mass. This is man and horse. Hegelian antagonism, suddenly, the slave master antagonism, suddenly the slave says, I know how to do everything here. Why should I be serving you? So it's like, it's a long story, but basically it animates again, the two figures kiss each other like a film. They animate like masking. And the structure is based on the principal mass. Sorry, run next. right next. This is next. Yeah, it's based on this photograph, and I think these two men are reenacting actually the principal mask of the Nyao of the Chewa, which is a mask, which is a who disguised as an antelope. Okay, next I'll show you the structure and we stop. It's this one. So yeah, if you have questions, you can ask me later. But basically, this is the Nyao structure I'm trying to simulate by these two figures. Shiremboni's womb, and the womb for us represents where we are all coming from. It's the less than nothing, if you like, in philosophy. And it's very clever in Malawi. We are matrilineal, but it's the matrilineal economy, the gift economy, if you like, is not represented by woman, by womb. I think it solves a lot of problems of situation I'm having with my students at Oxford. Africans already thought about it. Don't put the whole woman on the pedestal because the woman might want to do other things. Just put the womb. And anyway, the womb is not really like a reproductive womb. Everybody has this womb of possibility. So, okay. We'll stop there.
Good morning, everybody. For this session of searching and researching, I want to invite you into the creative lab of a cutting room of a work in progress, a new multi-screen installation, working title, Chambers of the Heart. In order to shine a light on some creative tensions in image and ideas formation that shape and flow through the process of making, my thanks here to Professor David Chung of the Stamp School of Art at the University of Michigan, where we have an institutional relationship shaped by Professor Oriana Baddeley. And also my thanks to researcher Iris Wakulenko. Together we are co-developing this project that we're about to have a window into. For 30 years in my own documentary practice, I sought to develop what I think about as intercultural documentary, an approach that insists on making visible the beautiful pluralism of Britain's truer and deeper reflection of itself and our histories. That shift was essential for my generation at a time when a single monoculture dominated television, public art spaces, most state institutions, and public life, spaces where the Windrush generations were invisible. And it's a privilege here to share the panel and the day with such significant voices in the making of pluralism in contemporary British culture. But the theme I investigate now is how to hold that exploration of difference in a period, hopefully not an age, but a period of disinformation and separation. Most storytelling across arts and media has a very big challenge today. Now, far too much of our mixed media landscape can be characterized by what Peter Coleman describes as toxic polarization. Whilst liberal democracies largely ignore these threats with a reflex defense of free speech, they are less practiced in reflecting on and counteracting the insidious effects of speech untethered from a central connecting vision of the tender and the delicate relationships of care that grow a collective culture. Key production processes and algorithms feed this polarizing trend, magnifying the attitudes that lean towards conflict. The profits of online vitriol are great and underpinned by an income generation model that rewards a lucrative and undertaxed trade in the heat and friction of polarization, catalyzing disaffection and driving people to extremist content. In much social media, the division is amplified. But today there are fewer bridges between ideas and opinions, a trend that hollows out the quality or sometimes even the prospect of dialogue in the public sphere and threatens to denature the connective tissue that forms the habitus of UK multiculture. In making the case for more relational storytelling, it's important to protect the essential work of robust and rigorous reporting and its significance, for example, in exposing crime, corruption, and holding officials to account. The argument here is not about so-called objectivity or the inevitable black and white aspects of the Fourth Estate. Rather, I'm trying to respond to the reflex polarization of so much media culture by researching relational ways of storytelling that can create restorative narratives. Reflections on documentary making led me to argue for a new focus on the centrality of ethics in practice, especially when recording lived experience. Without a clear ethical frame and an internal compass, too much of our media risks further damaging the situations it purports to describe, leaving yet more polarized trails for audiences to choose between. The way that practitioners rehearse these exploitative patterns begs uncomfortable and necessary ethical questions for many creative practices and their funders. Over the last 3-4 years, here's some of the things that the university, well, actually I've been producing, but with UAL. So asking questions about the nature of dialogue, what are the conditions for dialogue. This has an argument for what I'm about to show you is an example of an attempt towards restorative narrative. And then some reflections on the ethics for practitioners and institutions about how we go about storytelling. And then one resource the university has invested in, this website which explores some of the underpinning dynamics about how we work with another. So I'm mentioning all that if anyone wants to follow these things up, that's all available, or we can give you further links and copies of that material. Okay, so I'm about to make an argument for an experiment in bringing together film and media practices to rethink the art and information architecture for more relational storytelling, socially designed to be biased enough to nurture the connective tissues between communities, drawing on practice methodologies from restorative justice, including deep listening and searching for shades of grey. In finding stories that can model this, I continue to benefit from the nuanced research and clear analysis of writer and founder of the Forgiveness Project, Marina Cantacuzino, and the educational work that the charity does. Her careful unpicking of the shifting countercurrents of emotion, inspiration, and pain involved in understanding the motivations of victims and perpetrators gave me some confidence to try to learn to be with the two men you're about to meet and to attend to what a more visual exploration of the connection might mean. So what I'm about to show includes test footage, as Oriana signalled, from the beginnings of a work in the delicate process of becoming. Much more will be shot in the coming year, so these are glimpses of unresolved and emerging ideas. Technically, the sound is raw, the images are sometimes placeholders, the footage ungraded, and what you'll see is likely to appear on 3 separate screens or projections in an installation, rather than 3 images on the same screen that you'll see here. So please approach it with that in mind. I should say, actually, when I'm working with some of our wonderful students, I say be very careful who you let into the cutting room. So we're among friends. So could we just run the first 10 seconds? What happened here in the Milwaukee suburb of Oak Creek in August 2012 is an event so shocking that its ricochet is still felt even in the heavy lineage of race-based mass murders led by white supremacy in the United States. I heard about a man living here called Pratāp Kaleka, son of the Sikh temple president Satwant Singh Kaleka, one of 6 people murdered in the Milwaukee Gurudwara or Sikh temple shooting. Pradeep's response to me made it clear that revisiting his experience of the shooting would not risk re-traumatizing him. He wanted to share what happened. Quote, "I thought I was experiencing post-traumatic stress," he said, "but actually I'm now experiencing post-traumatic growth. I value each day more than someone who hasn't gone through this." And for me, when I heard that, I was thinking, what on earth could Pradeep's journey have been to get to that realization?
Needed anything, and those were the first 2 people who were shot outside, and their final resting place was kind of over by that vehicle over there, that black vehicle. And then after those 2 people were shot, there was 2 children who ran inside and started to warn everybody. And as they ran inside, people started to find their own hiding spots. So the first shot that was ever fired inside the temple here was fired at that frame.
But what of the white supremacist side of this story? In my early work, I would not make room for extremist opinion or the bigoted people whose hatred has caused so much hurt, loss, and sometimes death. Later on, in many places, and with people facing conflict or its aftermath, however, I listened closely, engaging sharp arguments on different sides of an event, an idea, or a conflict. In South Africa, Rwanda, Aboriginal Australia, here in the UK, and in many other places, I put counter-arguments to each side in the search for understandings for diverse audiences. There were curious highlights of this process too, for me personally. For example, being schooled in the logic of grand apartheid by 3 generations of the Verwoerd family in their home on their white-only homeland of Oriana. But I felt their presence was essential in a film about the future of the new South Africa. But I remained wary of giving space to known perpetrators unless in cross-examination, where scrutiny would emphasize their wrongdoing. For example, filming Gideon Nieuwoudt, the South African security policeman who applied for amnesty to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, the TRC of South Africa, for his role in the murder of Black consciousness leader Steve Biko. Nieuwoudt admitted hitting Biko with a cut-off rubber hose during interrogation in a police station in Port Elizabeth. After that, Biko suffered a slow and terrible death. I filmed Nieuwoudt's testimony, but did not, and in that situation could not connect with Nieuwoudt's human story. I then interviewed Steve Biko's oldest son, Nkosanathi Biko, after he listened to Nieuwoudt's evidence. I gave Biko much more screen time to shape the story. In this, I was guided by Emmanuel Levinas. His challenge? To pay profound attention to the face of the other as a way of preventing subsuming another's being into what he cautioned could become a totalizing vision. Levinas insists that the gaze of the other is primary, leaving us the ethical duty of creating and realizing our relatedness. Here in Milwaukee, the other didn't appear in the form of a state critic or social justice campaigner or an atrocity survivor, but a former white supremacist, Arno Michaelis, a founding member of what was claimed to be the largest racist skinhead organization in the world, the organization responsible for the Milwaukee Temple shootings.
This tattoo here is my last remaining racist tattoo. It says Rochat in Norse runes, which means racial holy war.
I had read about Arno Michaelis' violent history. I was horrified by the pleasure he took in so very, very many gratuitous and grievous violent attacks on very many people of color, gay people, Jewish people over the years. Alongside my own revulsion, I didn't know how far to push in exploring the histories of what he has done. By naming more of this, would an audience be too repelled to take in his story or even to listen to him again at all? Or might some celebrate his racist past? At the same time, do audiences have a right to know, and if so, how literal to be? Having found out as much as possible when faced with the real person, somehow letting the meeting and experience run through my body, an inner somatic awareness, is an important element in shaping a way of being in the act of looking, listening, and filming. As we increasingly know, the body keeps the score. The methodologies of nonviolent communication and mindful awareness have much to say about this in finding a response that integrates head and heart, anchored in somatic awareness. On a good day, the camera and my hands will find the frame that responds and know what to do or know how to guide others filming. This is always a heuristic experience for me, with discoveries and reconfiguration emerging from the liminal skin of the film, its makers and subjects. Leading me into this was Pratāp Kaleka with his own therapeutic training, his experience as a policeman and his inner knowledge of how to respond according to the Sikh teaching Chardikala, which means we move in relentless optimism. The temple shooter shot and killed himself after the murders. Pratāp found the strength to be confident for his family and community, but later came to feel and know that he was performing a false self, appearing strong for others, but collapsing inside. Pratāp needed to understand why the shooter did what he did, and thought Arno Michaelis might be the key. So he reached out to Arno after the mass shooting. Arno, for his part, some years after renouncing his extremism, knew that he bore some responsibility for the murders, having co-founded the organization that recruited disaffected white kids like the shooter. And here's an exchange about their first meeting.
I just remember that first question that you asked me of like, what happened to my eye? Caught me by surprise. And I was kind of, what did happen to my eye? As I started to go into the story of what happened to my eye, and I see you grimacing, and I see you feeling my pain.
Right.
I knew that at that point, our relationship started from a genuine place of empathy and understanding, care, and consideration. And as we sat down and we started to share about our fathers and our daughters and our struggles and our challenges and our hopes, at that point, you answered exactly what I needed you to answer at that point. Because there were so many people. The frustration of that time was when you went to different audiences and everybody, kind of put their hand down of, well, what is responsible for white supremacy in this country? What are we going to do about it? Is it about guns? Is it about, legislation? Is it about this thing or that thing? And as people put their hands down, you feel it's just sort of disillusioned.
Right.
And
so
when
not it.
Yeah, when you raised your hand and said, listen, you will not have to walk on this journey alone. I'm going to walk with you. And for you to step up. And I knew at that moment that I gained more than I could ever describe in words. And I think that's what the gift of this wound was.
Man. Thanks, man.
Oh, you're going to squeeze my heck out of my hand.
Like, as soon as I heard news of it, before it was revealed it was a white nationalist who had committed the attack, I just had this gut feeling that that's what it was about. And this gut feeling that, like, I had something to do with this before that was established by media. And I was not just shamed, like humiliated at my past behavior. And so I think definitely if we're thinking about the day-to-day work, and this seems like counterintuitive too, because my whole thing was like, I can never forget the people that I've hurt. I can never forget the harm that I've done. I need to be accountable for it every single day, always. And then later on, and especially what you've taught me over the past decade, is like, I can't be hating myself about it either. So it's this constant like balancing act of acknowledging that harm and being like dedicated to trying to reconcile it without like hating myself for doing those things. And it's always the people I have the hardest time finding compassion for are white nationalists. Like when ISIS was at its peak and the so-called Islamic State was committing some of the most atrocious acts that the world has seen in a broad scale in a long time, it's so easy to hate the people who did that. But it was easier for me to be like, well, I don't know what it's like to grow up in the Middle East with nothing, or to grow up in this oppressive regime, and I don't know, I've never walked in those shoes, and it wasn't like giving those guys a pass, but I had got to the point where it was, relatively easy for me to be compassionate towards ISIS or towards like some kid from the inner city who does a drive-by shooting, or anytime stuff like that happens. I'd always be like, yeah, well, I mean, I never shot anybody, but for the most part, just driving around and being an asshole, like it's hard to beat me as a kid. I set a pretty high bar for that. And then when the shooting happened, and I would think about Wade Page. It was like my first response was just this bitter hatred for him, and I think that hate was driven by my shame, because I was so ashamed that I was part of that, and I was so ashamed of the harm that I had done that was still reverberating and is still reverberating to this day. And what I've learned since then, a lot from you, is that if I'm hating myself and if I'm having this grudge against myself, it's gonna just absolutely neuter my potency to do something about those things. If I would have been overcome by my self-hatred the day we met, that would have been the type of thing where, okay, I can't even do this.
What became clear to me was that my role was to step back as much as possible from interviewing and let Anu and Pratāp find and refine the story in conversation and through friendship. The texture of friendship would therefore lead the encounter and many of the movements and shot choices that followed. What emerged in this complex unraveling truth was that as both victim and perpetrator, each held an invisible key to the other's journey from survival to new life. And here's the last clip, it's very short.
And I think when I got to the temple and then just saw all of the faces, that were just in a place of incredible pain, I knew that there was something that we all had to do. I just didn't know what.
Right.
And so some of the desperation really was, what do we do? How do we uplift this community?
In this last scene, the three separate but juxtaposed screens enable us to take a conversation and explore it as a dynamic happening, where shots and audio are not synchronous across the screen, but offer a way to reimagine and recreate a happening. I think of these forces as a kind of these forces of between victim and perpetrator as a kind of rhythm of the heart, producing systolic and diastolic pressure, attraction to the light of finding a way through loss, and revulsion at the hatreds and violence that have brought us to this place. I'm working with other practitioners like Dia Khan, Yuli Cohen, and Marina Cantacuzino to develop an educational resource aimed at supporting storytellers to develop listening and response skills that can help configure a space where the most challenging stories can be held, but be held in a way that dreams and invites connection. The show related to this is due to open in Detroit and Ann Arbor, and hopefully will be there in the run-up to the next US presidential election, and hopefully find a UK home too. An educational program developing alongside this work will host research debates using examples from Chambers of the Heart as a way of thinking about dialogue. To conclude, at a time when storytelling sees a drift toward yet more pointed and polarized antipathies of difference, this is a necessary time for audiences to explore our own heart chambers, like being curious to understand a perpetrator. I found that this work by turns threatens to topple my reflex certainties and dare to enter a place of not knowing and of imaginative identification, where the process of filming finds its own haptic visuality, its inner logic of response, its location and place. Like new neural pathways, exposure to restorative stories can make it more possible to imagine better outcomes from those who walk a path of transforming unspeakable loss. If the medium can become the message, what if the process of creating that media is dedicated to restoring relationships through the light of understanding difference, committed to an avowedly restorative approach to storytelling? What new visions may then flow from these new narratives and the ethics of such a media practice?
Thank you so much, Pratāp. That was fascinating. Mark,
Yes.
can I ask you to come up?
All I'm going to really do today is just offer a few provocations. But first of all, I'm going to say thanks very much for the invitation to speak today. It's always a pleasure to be invited into the room, and also an honor. So thank you very much. I think we forget how difficult and how hard fought for some of these platforms have been over time. This is a kind of text in process. I figured it would be a kind of just a way of sharing some ideas in the form of a gift. It's kind of called Fixing Up the House, the Passion of Photography. So we're in a time of reckoning with history. We are at a moment where salvage is required, scavenging work is necessary, and digging up the things from the archive for scrutiny is essential. Across the terrain of Western cultural institutions, there exists a sense of unease, a cultural turn, a dizzying political bewilderment concerning how to manage visual narratives of the colonial and the racist assumptions that have infused and defined it. I'm quoting Ariella Razule here. The museum, historically a space of affirmation and imperial knowledge exchange, has itself become an object of scrutiny, cited as a hostile place that creates instruments of violence. For me, this then is the dawning of the house of other, a new kind of cultural space that is open and welcoming. In this house, the uneasy narratives, histories are revealed and opened up for scrutiny. The house of other is not built solely on European foundations. In this space, notions of conquest and ownership are banished instead. In the house of other, difference is exalted, and indigenous cultural knowledge formations are given proper space to express themselves and realize their ends. Here, these knowledge systems are respected fully and equally valued alongside diverse ways of knowing in our world. In this house, the stranger is welcome, and otherness in all its forms is celebrated through cultural dreams of reparation and human generosity. So that talks to what Pratāp has been working with. This house champions justice and the return of cultural objects and their places of origin. It welcomes formal and legal apologies for historical wrongs. Museums and archives today are in the throes of profound change as they grapple with the fraught legacies of colonialism, imperialism, and slavery, all of which played fundamental roles in building the cultural institutions of the Western world. In the house of other, recognition and reckoning are given real value. Monuments are rethought, and unsung heroes are clothed with new dignity. In the house of other, indigenous knowledge formations are treated as sacred and revered. They are to be deployed as acts of empowerment and liberation for those who have been isolated, racialized, disconnected, and locked out of history. Here, hostile images are given new life and oxygen, allowed to breathe the fresh air of liberation once again. Sasha Huber, an artist I've been working with her current work that redresses the violence of Joseph T. Zeeley's daguerreotypes, commissioned in 1850 by Louis Agassiz, the founder of the Museum of Comparative Zoology in Harvard, aims to restore dignity to the victims of a racist lens. What I hope most for, especially in photography, during this cultural turn, is for its practitioners to demand not only social change, but also importantly for their works to live as impetus for meaning of legislative change. Although the House of Other is presently an imaginary house, its design and its positionality are highly influenced by the lives and works of its intellectual forebears. Prominent among them are the fierce insights of Frantz Fanon, the radical photography of Ernest Cole, the bravery and inspirational qualities of Ingrid Pollard, Carrie Mae Weems, Shahidul Alam, Sunil Gupta, and the many others who have worked to unfix the past, build spaces in which the diversity of this world's understanding and ways of being can surface and be seen. In the genocidal broken time of photography, its early days when the world was laid bare, ripped apart, expropriated by its imperial tools, and dominated by Eurocentric scopic regimes, Western eyes reigned supreme. How the West saw the rest tells as much about our current human condition than anything they encountered, read, mapped, or archived concerning the other from the times of extraction, from the time of extraction. I think we're living constantly in this time of extraction. This is the horror show of photography's past. Its messy science and its untidy history is only now beginning to surface as a tense and uncomfortable burden. I like the idea of tense and uncomfortable burdens because it keeps us agitated and it keeps us thinking. Photography's soul is being interrogated, its language systems, its captions, its categories, its indexical nature, its canons provide evidence in abundance of who and what is missing from its history. Now photography's missing chapters are being read out loud as archives and new photographic images from the global south confront photography's archives. The narrative now being amplified by other curatorial voices represents an exciting visual decoloniality in the making of photography's present history. The radicality in this gesture lies in the fact that photographers must stay in the making, thinking business, which ties into some of the things we were discussing this morning, the making, thinking business, and the making of difference. The old guard of photography, what I call the stuck ones, and the stuck ones live in most of our cultural industries all the time. They stop progress, and they keep us in the thick bog of progress, of lack of progress. The stuck ones are desperate to find ways to be associated with a decolonial process. They keep on trying to invent themselves as new people in a new world, and they keep their colonialities alive in the present. They keep us back. Stuck ones in the old meanings and recurring archival nightmares that recall the violence of photography's imperial and colonizing lineage. So we seem to be getting closer to the ground zero of photography. I like the idea of drilling out some of these imperial knowledge systems. So I think we have to go backwards a lot further before we can go forwards. I think we live in an age of constant denial, an age where we imagine that progress is there to be had, where there's so many ghosts in the system that we all are constantly haunted and spooked by the idea of change. We may, with the emergence of photographers such as Eileen Perrier, Latoya Ruby Frazier, Joy Gregory, Dina Lawson, see the beginning of what may become fully articulated archives that act as daring counter-narratives concerning the making of Black lives, nuanced, honest, complex, rounded bodies of work that have grown past and that have grown past the past and need to be celebrated in the present. Many dedicated scholars, such as Stuart Hall, Deborah Willis, Bell Hooks, Ariella Rizzulli, and Alana Lockwood, have opened new visual theoretical pathways through and into our understanding of the damage photography as an image-making mechanism in the hands of Western colonizing powers has done to our collective sense of humanity. They act as scholars working against the grain of imperial epistemes do not only critique, they point towards and celebrate new formations of lens-based culture and offer insight and lost hindsight into the work photographic images can do and perform in culture. This scholarly work feels forever pressing and critically essential today, especially when we open dialogues concerning technologies, old and new. That was the point of this morning. Technologies both old and new. Museums revamped or left languishing. And of course, the legacies of pseudo-scientific colonizing theories advanced by scholars. the legacies of whom are still being propagated through the noise of Western mass media channels that are both regulated and increasingly unregulated. So we seem to be dangerously distanced and disjointed, bodies floating in a deeply alienated, inherited cultural space that is not of majority world making. We never made this world. It's been made for us. How we change it is what's being contested. It's this space that many of our contemporary photographers, especially through the lens of autograph, and cultural theories, especially those who feel the presence of the global south in their DNA, in their gravity, in their history, in their gravity, in their history, in their place of time, in their place in time, have been trying to arrest, realign, and recreate so as to build a more inclusive worldview, seeking to create a global image bank that can function as a liberatory site, a global image bank as a liberatory site for all. Samuel Fossel's work sits within this tradition. He creates scenes in which the emotional, the personal, and the political meet to narrate the past, address the present, and to propose a shared future. Undoing imperial violence means undoing time, space, and the body politic as given forms of experience, as the transcendental conditions of understanding, perception, and judgment. That's Ariella Razuli again. How much time have I got left?
5 minutes?
Okay, well, we won't get through, but we'll carry on. Cultural distance fails us. Images may isolate us. Since the first contact with Europeans, indigenous cultures have been left precarious, constantly at risk of being erased, obliterated, or bulldozed into landfill, scorched, or drowned as a result of aggressive colonizing policies of extraction or contemporary forms of neoliberalism. The photographer Gideon Mendel, concerning his recent exhibition titled Fire and Flood, staged at the Photographers Gallery in London and shown in their recently opened Soho Photography Quarter, an initiative that turned the fabric of the street next to the gallery into a space of exhibition, states that his photographs bear witness to the brutal reality that the poorest people on the planet almost always suffer the most from climate change. Among the arresting aspects of Mendel's approach here is how close Mendel's statement echoes Frantz Fanon's radical book published in 1961, titled The Wretched of the Earth. So we've been having these conversations from a kind of global south for a very long time, and it seems we're not hearing them still. The Wretched of the Earth, a much-cited quotation from Fanon reads, "Imperialism leaves behind germs of rot," there's your plastic, which we most clinically detect and remove from our land, there's the new experiments, but we haven't ripped them from forms of our minds, from our minds' forms. The correlation between Fanon, Azoulay, and Mendel in this present moment operates like a powerful time-bending force that compresses distant historical concerns. Fanon's words breathe through photographers such as Mendel and are pulled forward into our present, released from the prison of history. I quite like the idea of a liberatory force that releases us from the prison of history, because some of us have been framed for so long and contained in that history. Azoulay rightly casts aside the temporality of timelines. Who needs time? Seems to me that when you have time, or we have time, we can't change anything in time. So who needs time? Azoulay sees the museum as a time trap, and Mendel is driven by a desire to represent that which is widely known but still ignored, recalling what W.E.B. Du Bois, writing in 1910, called the crisis. So the crisis. Pulling this enduring notion back into our consciousness, we are in crisis. Maybe then, the task of photography's future is to adopt a more fully pedagogic manifesto. It'd be nice to have a new manifesto for change. It'd be nice to have a new manifesto that we signed up to. It'd be great to align ourselves behind one position, to make change possible in real incremental time, okay? one that works within what Gayatri Spivak suggests to develop radical ways in which we learn from below. So Spivak's been talking about learning from below for a very long time, and we're still trying to find ways of doing that. Maybe the university needs to be a little bit more dynamic in that space, thus allowing us to discard the structures that create top-down forms of power and eradicate all forms of apartheid. I could go on, but I think I'll stop. Thanks very much.
Where do we start? That was so rich, all of you. It was so rich. And there are so many ways one could sort of dive into looking for relationships, but I don't want to be simplistic about that. And I just thought, one of the things I felt with all your presentations picked up on the point that Siân made this morning about hope being an active process, because all of you are trying to offer some way of actually moving forward. You're all wanting to be able to do something in a way that confronts the desperation we're all faced. The world is in a terrible place, ecologically, in terms of social justice, in terms of the politics of the everyday. But what we have in all your approaches, it seems to me to be an attempt to find something that can actually be done. A what is to be done moment. And I felt that with Samson and with... I don't know, does anyone want to come back on that?
Are you in for me? I don't know. I think the word "what can be done." I think inadvertently. I've been involved in building institutions in many ways. I think, even though it's very small, and then even the very term institution is problematic because it starts to replicate all the power structures you've been critical of. But I think one of the things I've enjoyed through a kind of curatorial thing, the idea of being able to work with practitioners and artists and writers and different scholars of people in the making game, is just how influential that can be in terms of the micro impacts that you can have on people's lives that hopefully add up to a greater sense of kind of unity and exposure to different ways of being or different ways of understanding our present. That's the takeaway really from working as a curator. I've never been interested in anything other than, actually, photography in a sense has just been another kind of tool, or thinking through photography I'm not a photographic historian. I'm always interested in the work is doing. I'm not someone who particularly celebrates the idea of having the luxury of making. For me, the making progress, this is where I differ from a lot of conversations. The luxury of just simply making for the pleasure of it is not not how I've been formulated. I've always been formulated in a way that, what tools can we have to fight the things that you feel, know, understand, and want to change, whether that's domestic violence or whether it's class issues. So for me, it's always been about the work is doing. I quite enjoy the fact that people have the luxury to be simply enter into the making place. But maybe generations after myself of people who might look like me might find that a place of ease, a place of rest. So in many ways, we're working toward that degree of kind of like parity, where judgment isn't upon you, where you can walk through the world and have a different sense of being without the threat of a kind of white racist nightmare around the corner, which some of us, the DNA of that is always in the background. It's not necessarily in Michigan where guns are. It's in everyday corners. So that's the practicality of where the hope lives. So the work is a conversation, an ongoing conversation, which is why I just wanted to present images with artists who are just working through these multiple conversations.
And it's very much a dialogue. It's not something you just do on your own, is it? It has to happen in relationship.
Yeah, with Autograph, it's basically always been a making organisation. Everything we do has a component of remaking within it. So we try and make something. We try and work with the artist through the ideas that they're kind of exercising out. And it's not finished. I hate the idea of things been finished. This is it. It's not it.
Do you want to come in at all, Samson?
Yes. I think the way can you hear me?
Yes.
You can. Okay. For me, actually, I came into Europe when I was 24, you know. So the work I do is actually, I need it. It's how I protect myself, how I make progress here.
Cheers.
And it was never just, for me, art was never just like a luxury. It's just the difference between me surviving here or not. So, yeah, I had to understand my tendency. I have a lot of nuance. I mean, I speak English and dress like a Westerner, but I have a lot of nuance in me that comes from Africa. If you spend some time with me, you'll realize that. And one of them is time. Yeah, you know, like for instance, I'm in the academy and in Africa, in Malawi, enthusiasm is seen as a good thing. Here, it's demonized. So I had to figure out. So when I started investing this Tanzania time, it's just simply to maybe explain myself to people, and it's worked in a way. It's worked in a way, and also being self-conscious of what I am against this kind of more structured, you know, environment in the West has helped me. For me, it's necessity. Art is necessity.
Is your idea of the gift, I mean, it strikes me, is also about empowering yourself. You can, a gift can, you are in control of a gift. You don't have to wait for someone to tell you what you can do.
Yeah, but you have to know how to, for instance, I've learned a lot. The gift got forced, the generosity forced. So for me, talking about it, maybe I'll tell you why. I'll tell you in a nutshell why there's it's always leads to exchange, you know. So societies that are built on the gift have to actually try to avoid exchange as far as possible, because exchange leads to pettiness. Let's say if I buy you a gift at Christmas, you give me back, and then you end up with all these tacky presents. The best form of giving is represented in matrilineal societies as that between mother and child, you know. Like, hence, our society is represented by the womb, a generosity. And so...
that makes sense. I can see how that works. Sorry, I think Pratāp wants to come in on that.
So for instance, for us, for me, an African, a sense of play is important, because if you take out the sense of play, then you only have this pet exchange. If you want a more meaningful life, then you introduce play, because it eliminates exchange, and then things are done in a much more meaningful way. I don't know, like for instance, for me, I'm very open and generous. That gets me in trouble often, but it also may take me to other places that people wouldn't go, because I'm just moving with an open heart, childlike. That's what it means. But anyway, for me, being conscious that my default in life is for a certain generosity has been important. Because if I wasn't, I would have demonized myself, lost my self-esteem. Because a lot of things I represent are demonized here, you know? In the other way, everywhere.
That makes a lot of sense, and you've done a wonderful segue to Pratāp with your discussion about the open heart. Yeah. If you wanted to come in on that, Pratāp.
Yes, thanks. And something about hope and the gift. The phrase that Pradeep uses in that single shot of him, the gift of our wounds. Obviously, this is an unwanted gift, but what he and Arno have found is something which is born of great loss, unspeakable loss. This is something common to a number of people. Marina Cantacuzino is in the room, and she had me mediate a conversation between a mum, Joan Scourfield, and the young man who murdered her son, Jacob Dunn. And what they typically this takes several years of ability to stay present to loss, grief. When you're talking about hope and despair, it makes me think a little bit of Rumi's poem, The Guest House, I think. Welcome each visitor. And I think this kind of work, it's fantastic to have hope. Life's a lot easier and the work's much easier when we're in that space. But I think the work's much bigger than hope or despair. In a certain sense, the structural shift needs to be free of whatever the feeling tone or way an institution wants to think about itself, talk about itself, the way we individually feel on that particular day, in order to meet the scale of the injustices or the loss and the beauty to be born from that. And with very special people, like some of the people we've been thinking about and listening to their responses, something new and much finer is born from being true to that, and that's an extraordinary gift to the culture. And that's a gift a bit more as a metaphor. It's not just literally, me giving you a glass of water or the other way around. That's fantastic when that happens. But this is something much bigger to do with the nature of attending to, in this case, suffering. And
well, it's also about the capacity to receive. I mean, the gift always suggests that someone's giving you. I mean, the gift is how you acknowledge what you've been given, and I think that lack of knowledge of what's been given, whether it's indigenous knowledge or whether it's other cultural assets that others have, the refusal of those gifts is part of that violence, if you like.
You make me think of the 1832 Macaulay Minute from our British Parliament, which was new to its growing empire in India, and Macaulay's 1832 Minute described the whole of Indian culture as worth a single bookshelf in the great library of British Europe. So what we've inherited in cultural imperialism is so saturated that gradually, the gift of now and the wonder of London and some other places is that we can dare to have these conversations around our competing histories and try to develop. I think we're now at the most interesting time because we're not just juxtaposition of the different people in the room. We're at a place where we can start weaving a story that relates to what we want it to in each other's histories. It's not caricatured, but the narratives we inherit typically are caricatured.
No, they really are, and they're messy. But I think this, I'm hoping, if we want to stay in the hope and the gift game, that the idea of being able to receive is taken on board. I think it's funny, isn't it? Because there's always a sense of innovation and new and progress. Actually, maybe I was wondering whether the pandemic maybe helped people stop a little bit, and be present. Without necessarily feeling as though you're caught in the, this is why, I have kids and they're worried about how old I am. I say, well, don't worry about how old I am. It's more about what I'm thinking rather than what my age does. So let's stop thinking about time. So when you stop thinking about time and you just start thinking about what you think about, it's much more interesting and you allow yourself to be present. It's really interesting how we forget to be in our time and enjoy that.
Do you think
find
that
pleasure in that
accepting the
space.
gift is a little bit like allowing oneself to be present?
Yes,
Because I think
absolutely.
that's how we kind of sort of. I mean, one of the things I was thinking while we were talking, and I'll come to the audience in a moment, that we've got a quote at the beginning of our session, which was from a lovely group of researchers, James Bully and Ogden Siân, and they said. And this was it was a report on practice research for the research councils. They said, in practice research, forms of intuitive, embodied, tacit, imaginative, affective, and sensory ways of knowing can be conveyed. And its sharing presents an opportunity for the modernizing and revitalizing of research communication, uncovering novel dissemination routes in a digital era. And it seems to me, that's quite dry. That's someone writing.
Very good, though.
But actually, it's kind of what we're saying. You can do things. You, as a curator, you, as a filmmaker, Samson, as an artist, can do things that you couldn't do with some other modes of communication. And I think that's sort of what we're trying to talk about today. The idea of building a new house as well is really important to me in terms of thinking, because the house of bondage, which of course Ernest Cole was talking about, the apartheid regimes, is we are in it. Yes.
So the institutional kind of gambit, I would argue, including this house, is how do we rebuild it? I'm not talking about knocking it down, but what kind of infrastructure do you need to walk into a place that feels built anew? And I think that's really the challenge. And I'm not talking about, I'm not talking about, new policies around diversity and inclusion. I'm not talking about mapping the color of your staff. I'm talking about mapping the color of how we think. I'm framed very much within a kind of 1960s, 70s black consciousness space. For me, the mind is where the place lives, and that's where the exchange needs to happen, and that's where the university and the thinking stuff has to be engaged. And when the mind changes, the other things that we're trying to achieve, i.e. become a more tolerant, more humane, more complex, more involved, more with equality built into it, I hope that those things then begin to seep into the DNA of the building. That, for me, is really, really where the radical thinking needs to happen, from what we wear to what we look at to what we say to how we travel to where we kind of engage in a kind of global context.
You're right, that's
without
right.
the matrix of all those decolonial narratives at play at the same time, we become a kind of, a performing set of radical, liberal, wet folk who want to talk and share and have a pint of beer about what change might look like. We forget the capacity to act. And that's not always easy.
And that was very much, this morning was about a capacity to act. I'm really fascinated about how such different subjects, but something. Can I just let the audience, sorry, is that a question or a hand semi-raised? Wait for the microphone.
Here it comes.
Picking up on what Mark's just been saying, let me put it this way. Our hope for curation is that the painting will come down. I'm referring to Sonia and what she did in Manchester. Now, it doesn't matter if the painting then goes back up, because it's now possible for it to come down. What I don't hope for is that they add a plaque to Cecil Rhodes. Doesn't help.
I agree.
Anyone else want to come in? Over there.
Thank you very much for your conversations. Listening to everything you've all said, three wise men.
Thanks for that.
There's something.
That's it, I'm going home now.
There's something about. There's two things I want to say. One is about enabling us people to have a space to think, to actually open up a space to think. There's that. Pratāp's films, and I've seen them before, and I keep reflecting on them. There's something for me as a British-born, of parents of the Caribbean, and this insatiable thing of it's all right for white people to just say sorry. You can say sorry and everything's all right. Yet, if a person of colour in Clapham Junction of the age of 16 or 17 steals some chewing gum, they're put away for 4 years. So when I talk about social justice, when we talk about social justice, there needs to be some sort of equilibrium here. And it's fine to talk about people being sorry and getting together and, for want of a better word, kumbaya. There needs to be some justice. And when we talk about the use of cotton, when we talk about pollutants in our oceans, where's it come from? Who are the people doing it? What do they look like? What is their power? And when will true justice happen? That's the sort of thinking, those conversations that I want to look at. There's something missing here.
Yeah.
That's just me trying to be logical. I'm not sure if I am. Anyway, thanks.
Very logical.
Well, can I come in?
Sam, I think Sam's going.
Yeah, where are these people? For me, actually, so for me, it's about paradigms, actually. People think, oh, I never called anybody names, I can be a racist and stuff, but actually, let's say a topic like racism is systemic, so it's paradigms. And I personally, what I find the hardest is to be who I am. It's not enough to just say, okay, we are taking in black people, but also systems. And that's what I'm fighting for. For me, it's changing those paradigms. And the universities are structured in a certain way that excludes a lot of people like me, actually. There are philosophies, there are knowledges that are created differently from the academy, and those are also viable ways of creating knowledge. But if the universities are only tied to, let's say, capital, then yeah, a lot of what I would call racism is going to continue, because like whole swaths of people, like for instance in Southern Africa, don't follow the values so it's not just allowing these people from South Africa into the room, but it's also trying to accommodate their thinking, their ways of doing things. That's what it's about. Yeah, so for me, I judge a system through paradigms. It's not just a simple black-white, but it's about, I'm interested in which paradigm are you using to speak to me. Yeah. It's very important.
Anyone else want to?
I was just going to.
I had to,
Samson,
yeah, sorry.
No, carry on, Samson. Sorry. You go ahead. Well, mine was a very simple thing. I often wonder what justice looks like. And I think here we are in a kind of creative, industry, and I think it's very hard to see it. You can sometimes feel it. You can probably imagine it in a kind of liberatory, good moment. But I sometimes wonder what justice really looks like. I can see it as a case. I'm really interested in kind of, a lot of my thinking is formulated in the idea of a kind of post-World War II world where things are supposed to be remade new, and there were new constitutions, declarations. Cold War screwed up most of that, and people are left with a kind of, violent kind of legacy of looking for what, democracy and its flaws looks like. So I kind of think, well, what does justice look like? What do we really want? And I think this is what I meant by like a manifesto. It's important to not just talk about it, but to maybe align ourselves to it, even if it's not exactly what we personally want, but there must come a place where you decide that collectively I will sign up to that part of the road to justice. I think what we imagine is that there's going to be a kind of, a dawning. Tomorrow will be a new moment, but it's not going to be like that. It's going to be very incremental, and it's going to be and a lot of hard work, and it's going to be a lot of actually, conceding your own personal desires to move towards some degree of collective thinking. And I think the reason why I'm interested in institutions like UAL or other universities or places of thinking or influence is that you're actually in a power dynamic which can amplify the concerns that the student body and its cohort of kind of workers want. So that's really an interesting sense of what you would how you would put power to work. So if I've been around this university for a couple of years, let's say, I'm thinking, what's the work, the power work, collectively around the changes that we've subscribed to, and where and how do we feel its influence, and how do we align to that space? So you have to forgive me, I'm a kind of old leftist Marxist in that space, but I think you do have to line up behind points of change and then move away from those fractured, siloed places, the whole divide and rule space, and think through those kind of incremental changes that you want.
We need to wind up, but maybe one just. Do you want to? You haven't had a chance to come back because you.
That's okay. No, I really appreciate your response, Jenny. But also I wanted to take really seriously what you say about divided spaces, and the depth of the frustration of the lack of social justice. And what I'd welcome is this kind of conversation being possible. There are certain things that don't get surfaced, and I think what you're pointing your finger at, Jenny, is really very, very significant. And I don't think that gets heard. And I don't think that the extraordinary stories, one of which we glimpsed a little bit in Formation, I don't think that this culture knows how to value those extraordinary journeys yet. And that's partly because we've yet to create the conditions of contact in order to truly be with each other. And I don't think you can go directly into that dialogue space, something I've learned from restorative narrative training, because you risk simply rehearsing the old power imbalances and the traumas that many people have experienced. Until what Mary-Louise Pratt describes as in her book Transculturation, until we get the conditions of contact somewhere near something that might begin to look like equity, we will not be able to attend to each other. But I don't want to leave it in my own practice. I don't want to leave it simply in that way. I'm impressed, moved, inspired by the extraordinary stories of people year on year who live with some of the things we've talked about and find a way through to start having that conversation.
I think we have to stop it there.